And anyway, we'll start. I guess we'll start. We are on time, and we'll start. And first of all, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. And before we proceed, I would like to introduce you to our Dean, Glenn Gerstner. Dean, would you mind to say a few words to us?
Thank you, Dr. Montero. Good to be here tonight. I want to thank especially Mark, our guest speaker, for coming in. You know, when I glanced at the flyer and it says corporate social responsibility, my original training, although my discipline now is sport management, I've trained in economics. And I think every time I see the word social responsibility, the first person that comes to mind is the Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman, who, I'm paraphrasing here, the corporate responsibility of business is business. Now, when he said this in the late 60s, early 70s, sustainable development was not part of the language. Right? Nobody had any idea about what sustainable development was, not to mention the myriad of other issues that are now part of social responsibility. If it were only so easy, right, that the business of business is business, we're all well aware that it isn't. So I don't want to take away any time from Mark. I appreciate his coming here. And Basilio, thank you for letting me say a few words. Students, welcome. And guests from all over the world, glad you could make it. Thank you, Basilio.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gerstner, for being with us. And I'm glad to, first of all, welcome everyone. And this is going to be an interesting conversation. And we are really pleased to have a guest speaker who has a tremendous experience throughout the world, and particularly, I think he spent for the last 10 years in the African continent. And he kind of comes with that ground up experience. And he works with a very well-known company called the BAYER, which is a pharmaceutical company. I'm sure you all have bought aspirin, right, Mark? You have bought aspirin from them. And so it's very interesting to see how this company, BAYER, which is the German company based in Germany, has this corporate social responsibility. And in their research and development department, they have this special dedicated department, and that is looking after the sustainable development understanding of it, social and corporate social responsibility. So we couldn't be happier when the corporate world and the development world, they kind of meets together. So his particular Mark's particular specialty is working in the low and middle income countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. And I think that is fascinating, and that is so enriching, particularly today than ever before. So he's speaking to us today from St. Louis, Missouri, and he has been spending a lot of time in Europe, and he's a lot of time spent, has been part of the BAYER company for some time, and he's has previously held roles in Europe, in Africa, marketing lead, the global cotton product manager, and director of trade marketing at Corn States. So his background includes experience in biotech research, many aspects of managing seed business development, as well as the grain export business. He has a bachelor's in science from Iowa State University and a master's of science in genetics from the University of California at Davis, and also an MBA from Drake University. As he goes along to doing the presentation, you will see his depth of his knowledge and how much he has to offer. I want to say a special thanks. I'm starting to see her name, to one of our students. Thanks to her that we are able to have this evening together. Natalia Gundel. Natalia Gundel is the catalytic agent of this evening. And thanks to her that we are able to have this terrific evening together. And thank you all for joining. So my colleague and your professor, Mina Horowitz will be moderating. She'll be keeping an eye on your charts, on your questions. So I would encourage you to send questions via the chat. And I know our speaker, Mr. Edge, has told us he's looking forward for this conversation. And he also told us that please feel free to interrupt him anytime. Okay. So as you know, if you go on the participant list, on the participants, if you hover your name, you'll get a sign that you can kind of raise your hand, okay, and call in. And so Professor Horowitz will keep an eye on that, and so we'll be there. I thank you, Professor Mark, for joining us, and there's enough of faculty here. So it's wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much. Professor Horowitz, it's all yours.
And also from my behalf, my deepest thanks to Natalia, with whom I'm studying right now. I teach international communication and digital communities this semester for those with whom we haven't met. But without further ado, I would like to give floor to Mark, if I may. And as Basilio said, as Dr. Monteiro said, please use the chat. My students from ICM 801 have already sent in a few questions that Mark knows that there are deep and important questions coming up from you, but anybody and everybody, let's make this a wonderful interactive session for all of us. But without further ado, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mina and Basilio. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening to talk with all of you. This is a bit of a challenge to figure out what's the right way to communicate with all of you about all the different things that are going on at BAYER and the connection with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think maybe one of the first things is for me to give myself a bit of a disclaimer that I'm not a communications expert. I started out on a farm in Iowa. I grew up farming. My family still farms, and so I come from a very sort of agriculture perspective of how things work in the agricultural world. I've been in this business for the seeds and traits business for probably the last 25 years, really focused on how do we get new technology from research into the marketplace. And I've done that in the US, and I've done it in Australia, in Latin America, Europe, and Africa. And I would say that across those years, one of the things that I've learned is the importance of being able to do a better job of communicating and understanding how technology needs to be translated into words that the average person can understand, and how do you build trust. And I think that the Sustainable Development Goals and what we do at BAYER fit really well together with all of that. And so what I hope is that I spur a number of questions that many of you have. I hope that we are able to try to do this in an interactive way so that as I'm going along, if you have questions, we can interrupt the conversation and have those questions and address that, rather than just me doing a download of sort of my, things I think that you might want to hear. When I was putting together this, I did put together a slide deck that has a number of things. I think it's maybe important to try to frame what BAYER, what kind of a company BAYER is, how we see that it connects with Sustainable Development Goals, and then talk about specifically sort of the crop science division of BAYER, which is what I'm part of. So I try to bring it into it's big picture. It's much bigger than what I do. It's so many different things, but also try to make it a little bit personal from a standpoint of the work that I do. And as Basilio mentioned, I've been working for the last 9 years in Africa, trying to develop drought tolerant and insect resistant corn. So I've been on that project, and it's a public-private partnership with funded by the Gates Foundation and USAID, working with 7 countries in Africa and a nonprofit based in Africa and a research organization. So there's all sorts of things I'd love to tell you specifically about that project and what I'm doing, but that's not what I've done here today from a presentation standpoint. I've tried to get that you're more of a general audience of the overall view of the Sustainable Development Goals and how BAYER thinks about it and how our corporate social responsibility fits into all of that. So I'll share my screen here, and hopefully you'll have a presentation here that you can see. Let's see. Is it coming through?
Yeah.
Okay, so BAYER is talking about our sustainable development goals. My title is Director of Seeds and Traits Business Development for Low and Middle Income Countries. And we have three basic business areas: our crop science division, our pharmaceuticals division, and then our consumer health division. So I won't go into all of the details around each one of those, but I think it's important to understand that there's a commonality across this in that a lot of this stuff is connected by science. If you're doing biology research, if you're in, doing DNA sequencing or anything related to biology, you can be in crop science or you can be in pharmaceuticals, and then some of that goes into consumer health as well. So there's a thing that they kind of call as a life sciences company, in that we're dealing with all of these biological things. And now it's, of course, also highly connected with digital tools, because digital transformation is changing the way that we do the research as well. Let's see, I clicked to go forward, but it didn't go forward. There we go. So just a little bit about our business, our size. It's our sales is $43.5 billion, 103,000 employees. Our investment in research and development is $5.3 billion, and we're in about 87 countries around the globe. This is not advancing. Okay, so we have a vision as a company of who we want to be, and to sum it up, it's health for all and hunger for none is our vision of what we want to try to do. That brings in that whole thing about the pharmaceutical side of it, but crop science is actually about health as well, because your diet, your food, nutrition that you eat really affects your health. And we also want to make sure that we're doing this on the crop science side, the hunger for none, and that we have enough food for everybody. So this is the fundamental challenge that we have. And we look at our purpose as a company as really being science for a better life. So science is at the center of all of these things that we do. And we're saying innovation technology is really a driver for the health for all and hunger for none as part of what we do. Connecting that to our sustainable development goals then is that we want to leverage all of our potential in addressing these world's urgent challenges. And the sustainable development goals really create an opportunity for a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity across the world. So I don't need to tell all of you about that. I mean, the understanding about the sustainable development goals. One of the things I see about the sustainable development goals is that they create a common language for us to talk about across all of these different stakeholders that there are in the world and that have a role to play in this. And so BAYER is just one of hundreds of thousands of companies that are out there in the world trying to sell our products and be sustainable by making a profit, but also making the world a better place. And this sustainable development goals really does create sort of a format for us to frame what are the places of how we can connect to these different 17 goals that there are, and how do we participate in that to be addressing these challenges of the aging world and growing world population and the unsustainable ecological footprint. I'm having troubles with the advancing here. So we see it as we step back and look at it from a sort of a macro view of the world and how BAYER is going to interact with that world is that there's three fundamental driving forces that are changing the world from our perspective. There's this economic and political power shift that's going on. The world is quite different today than it was 50 years ago. There's also the clearness now that it's the age of the Anthropocene, and that humans are making a huge impact on the environment, and we're overstepping our planetary boundaries. And then there's this convergence of biology and computing power that's really creating a lot of challenges from a societal standpoint, values and ethics that are involved, and how do you bring all of this new technology together and still maintain the cultural values and the society that you want. So it's a lot of really fundamental forces that are driving there. And if we look a little deeper at this, enabling prosperity of a growing and changing population, This is Hans Rosling's view of how we need to think of how we can think about the world. So if I can orient your mind here a little bit, in the center is these four levels of sort of life on 4 income levels: level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. And if you look at just the middle, or the second one down there, transportation. At level 1, you're walking. At level 2, you have a bicycle. At level 3, you have a motorcycle. And at level 4, you have a car. And so this is a way you can see this across different things about clothing, food, energy, all those different things, where we, sleeping circumstances, all of these different things at different levels of what we're dealing with. If we look on the left side of this at 2017, this sort of shows you how the world looks today. You see that there's a preponderance of people that are actually in level 2. There's still too many that are in level 1, unfortunately. But also you can see that level 2 is predominantly also Asia. So the red boxes there are the Asian part of it, the blue is Africa, the green is the Americas, and the yellow is the Northern European part of the world. And so you can sort of see the stratification of it, how it is today in 2017, that there's actually not very many up at level 4, and they're not very well distributed around the world. If you move to 2040, we're looking at actually a growing population, but also you see this incoming increase of moving from level 2 to level 3. That's going to take a lot of resources to be able to move to that sort of thing. So this is one of the key drivers that we see, and there's so many things that are tied up in that whole shift that is going to be required as far as the resources that are needed to support that many people at that sort of a level of lifestyle. And clearly, if we lived in a utopian world, we'd love for everybody to be at level 4 and there to be no, environmental negative impact, and that everything is sustainable at that. So if you think about the goal of where we're trying to get to, we're still going to be a long ways away from our goal in 2040 of what we would love to see. But the challenges of what we see in the next 20 years are pretty daunting. The next thing that we go to is these planetary boundaries. So the concept here is that we only have one Earth, and we only have so many resources, and we have to live within those resources. And currently, there's a couple of things where we're beyond what sort of is sustainable for the boundaries. And so climate change is one of those obvious ones. But there's also the biogeochemistry nitrogen cycle. So there's too much nitrogen being used today. So that's something that's really central to what we're trying to do in crop science, for example, is how do we grow crops more efficiently and do it within those planetary boundaries. And another big one that's central to us in crop science is the biodiversity loss. It's very important that we maintain this biodiversity on there so that we have a healthy planet. And then the last one is really the social piece of this, of finding that sweet spots for humans and the planet to coexist. So this sort of shows you that there's all of these different factors around there: the water, the food, the income, education, jobs, energy, all of these things. And then around the outside, the issues of land use changes, freshwater use, all of these things. Well, there's a social foundation of what we need to have, and say, this is what we need to have for a healthy society to have, that you need to use some of these resources, and it is going to have an impact on the environment, but it has to be at a level that is below this environmental ceiling. And so this is what society is dealing with, is trying to figure out where is this sweet spot or this donut that we can live in, where it's actually find a relative balance that we can find that it's long-term sustainable and beneficial for humans. So those things come together, and we say, the science is really clear. The loss of biodiversity is a huge challenge for us. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented. The world population is expected to increase by 2 billion in the next 30 years. And that climate change is causing all sorts of challenges, and it's accounting for, agriculture, forestry, and other types of land use are actually accounting for 23% of the human greenhouse gas emissions. So that's sometimes something that gets missed a little bit in this, is that agriculture and what we're doing is actually a potential of sequestering carbon and taking carbon out of the air, but we're also doing things that are putting carbon out into the environment. And so how do we find the balance and change that paradigm? So bringing it around to what BAYER is as our pivotal role in contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals, this is sort of a way that we've addressed the different parts of the Sustainable Development Goals connecting with our business. So over here on the left, upper left, you can see that's preserving and restoring the health and providing education, not only for, for family planning, but also for education for sustainable farming and nutrition. Then you can go to the upper right there, and you can see that we're talking about food security, micronutrients, and livelihoods of smallholder farmers and empowering women. In the lower right hand, we're talking about environmental things like greenhouse gas emissions and resource conservation practices and seeds to get more, using less. And then over on the bottom left-hand side is, sustainable agricultural, preserving the biodiversity of their, greenhouse gas emissions, the environmental impact, and limiting land use. So when we look at all these 17 various goals, so that they're sustainable development goals, we actually can find a connection of all of them to our business at BAYER, because we are a life sciences company. We do deal with these things in the pharmaceuticals, the consumer health, and the agriculture parts of the society. So now I'm going to move into talking specifically about crop science, but maybe I should stop there for a moment before I go into specifics of crop science and say, have I lost anybody or got any questions? And first of all, can you still all hear me? One time I was talking and I went for 5 minutes, I think, and people couldn't hear me. So are you still there?
We hear you perfectly. There are
okay.
a couple of questions that have come up that are a little bit more general, but anybody wants to comment at this point? Let me see the people are now voting which ones of the challenges are the biggest challenges.
Okay.
And so let's see what.
Yeah.
Food security seems to be winning at this point.
Okay.
So crop science is
so I think it'll be good then. I'll just go into the crop science part of this and focus on that, because that's sort of my wheelhouse. If you start to ask me too many questions about pharmaceuticals, I'm going to be in over my head very quickly, just to be honest with you. So, but it is interesting, I think, how all of these things do connect through the science. Once when I was studying to be studying genetic engineering, actually it looked like the jobs that were going to be available for me were more in pharmaceuticals than they were in crop science. So those areas are definitely connected at the basic levels. But as we talk about agriculture going forward and shaping agriculture to benefit farmers, consumers, and our planet, as we think about our mission within crop science, we're really focused on innovation, digital transformation, and sustainability. We see those as really the things that we need to be in. We're the industry leader, and we have to lead in these three areas of innovation, digital transformation, and sustainability. And as we do that, we're going to come up with tailored solutions that are key to sustainability, managing resources, and improving productivity at the individual farmer level. So what we need on my farm in Iowa is not the same thing as what they need in Kenya for the farms that we're working there. And we need to come up with tailored solutions that fit for that particular environment, fit for that culture, fit for the, the circumstances and the economy that is there. And so this is a huge opportunity and a big challenge as well as we go forward to work through all of that complexity. As we think about this tailored solutions, there's a couple things, though, that we know about farmers. So I do know that whether I'm a farmer in Iowa or a farmer in Kenya, there's about 40 decisions each season that a farmer has to go through. We're deciding about which seeds to purchase or which seeds to plant, which crops to grow, what fertilizer to put on, what approach are you going to do for tillage, what are you going to do for weed control, what are you going to do for harvest programs. What are you going to do from a marketing standpoint once you have your grain? All of these things are questions that come through. And so you can think about agriculture from this. And this is where it becomes important for the digital transformation as well, is that you can start to think about these major decisions that they are and say, what is the information that needs to go into making those decisions? And how do we help farmers make better decisions as they're going forward? So as we think about that, that's where we look at continuous innovation is really going to be the driver of environmental sustainability, profitability, and high quality crops. We've seen over the years, just in my lifetime, I've seen increases significant of increased productivity, and we need less land to produce the same amount. And it's really very remarkable how much we have increased productivity without having to actually increase the amount of land that is used or the amount of resources that are used. So our efficiency today versus what it was 50 years ago is substantially improved, but there's still a long, long ways to go. And innovation is one of the key drivers of that. And this is where the data science part also comes in, is that we really need to use those data sciences to resources to feed the growing population. These decisions are so intertwined with the environment and so many variables that the more information that you can gather about all of this, then you can actually start to use artificial intelligence to help you make your decisions. Now, that's just going to give you a probability, an increased probability. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a guarantee that you get a good result, because there's always the unexpected that happens. And this is one of the worst things that people, that farmers experience. And oftentimes, I think many people don't really quite comprehend is, on a macro scale across agriculture, for example, you're not hearing today about that there's going to be a shortage of corn in the United States, okay? Because we're going to have a pretty good corn crop this year. But I don't know how many of you have heard about the derecho that came through Iowa, but there was this big windstorm that came through and it flattened 10 million acres of corn. So if you happen to be one of those farmers that's in that area where that storm came through and it just flattened your whole fields, you get zero crop. So society is not in trouble, but you as a farmer are. And so this risk at the individual level is one of those things that no amount of data is actually going to take that away, but we can actually try to minimize that and figure out how do we increase our probabilities and do that and make better decisions. So when we think about growing healthy, safe, and affordable food, we really need to take a holistic view of sustainable agriculture and focus on these three factors: the environment, the social, and the economic progress. So we've got the social responsibility of improving the people's quality of life. Oh, now it's supposed to advance, hang on. It also comes in that we have the environmental responsibility of preserving our environment. Now, these two things can actually be in conflict with each other. And then the last thing we have is that we have the economic success, increasing the farmer's profitability. And it takes all three of those to create a sustainable system. And what we have to do is figure out how to manage the trade-offs. And because when you do one thing, it has an impact on the other thing. And so there is no simple silver bullet solution to all of this. It really is about using the best tools available to make good decisions about managing that risk and working through those challenges. And that's what our business tries to do. Another thing that I think is important to capture here is that food is a very emotional and specific topic. It really requires a whole thinking around this. And so what I can tell you is from prior experience on this, of like introducing a new technology and thinking about it just from the standpoint of what it means to the farmer is no longer enough, because food is going from the field to the fork. And you really need to engage society in a very emotional way about how food is part of their culture, how food is important to them, and how agriculture fits in and all of that. So I think we've been learning over the years how critical this is, and the piece, and this is one of the areas that I think communications folks have helped us as much as possible to try to communicate the science, but do it in an emotional way that connects with people. And it's really important to be able to make that emotional connection as we go forward. So as we think about our approach at Bayer to sustainable agriculture, we really have a couple of guiding principles that are most important to us. One is to focus on transformational topics. We've got to make sure that we're doing something that's, we're a significant company. We're being asked to do big things. So we have to focus on those things that are going to be transformational. How can you really change the way things are being done today? Digital transformation is one of those things that we can do to make that difference. But we also have to always keep the farmer's perspective in mind and create value transparently for the environment and society. So the farmers are who pay our bills. We sell our products to farmers. And therefore, their perspective is really important, but balancing it with these other issues is always central to what we need to do. Then we need to link the sustainability strategy to the core of our business and our research and development and technology. So we are, as a company, making sustainability not just a corporate social responsibility where the folks in communications talk about it and we try to make a nice story about it. We basically have built in that sustainability has to be part of our business. We make farmers more effective and better if they're more efficient and more sustainable. Everything that we need to do has to be thinking about the sustainability of our customers, the sustainability in society, and bringing all of these things together so that we really make it core to our business. And then we have to figure out what we're going to measure. We have to have key performance indicators because you get what you measure. If you're not measuring something, you're not going to care about it. So the bottom line is that we have to create those measures out there that are actually going to reflect what it is that we're doing. And so there's whole teams within Bayer that work on focusing on the metrics of what are the key performance indicators that show that we're making progress. Another thing to really think about is how do we do this? Not just what do we do, but how do we do it? Because in order to get society's support and trust, you really need to do this responsibility. So building that trust is really transparency, education, and dialogue with folks is really critical. And that's one of the reasons I'm talking with all of you here this evening. It's part of that outreach to others to say, we have nothing to hide. We want to share with all of you. We need to do a better job of communicating, and all of you that are in the profession of communication can help us to do this in a responsible way. We've got to operate responsibility, ensuring our products are safe, and we have to support the stewardship of it. So not only does it need to be safe, but we have to be done in a way that is very stewarded so that it'll last for a good long time and be sustainable. So next I'm going to go into our specific sustainability commitments with Bayer. So this is what I've given you is sort of the philosophy within the company around how we are approaching things around sustainability. Now I'm going to get into the specifics of what the commitments we have made in the last year out there. So on living up to our responsibility of commitments, we have committed to the world, so to speak, that we're going to advance a carbon zero future for agriculture. So by 2030, we're targeting to reduce by 30% field greenhouse gases emitted per kilo of crops produced. So a 30% reduction in greenhouse gases is the first commitment. Second commitment is produce higher yielding crops using fewer natural resources and inputs. So we're going to reduce by 30% crop protection impact on the environment. Now I want to point out that this is about impact on the environment. Not all crop protection things are created equal. So one product could be extremely toxic and need to be taken off of the market. Another product you could be putting on twice as much of that product, but it's only 1/10 as toxic to the environment. So the whole thing is to reduce the impact on the environment by 30% and really reduce the use of hazardous pesticides to the extent possible, trying to find again the balance of managing these trade-offs. And then the last one, which is the sort of my wheelhouse of where I work, is really as empowering smallholder farmers to access sustainable agriculture solutions. So we're targeting to empower 100 million smallholder farmers by 2030 to get to benefit from access to education, products, and partnerships. So those are our three basic commitments in crop science to sustainability. So here I can go into the specifics on the greenhouse gas. When we do this, again, it's the 30% reduction, but the question is, how do we do it and our levers for success? And here are bringing in the connection to the Sustainable Development Goals. So on this, carbon reduction piece, there's a number of levers that we have for success. One is the crop genetics and the crop protection, the water use efficiency. One of the things I've worked on is drought tolerant corn. So we're bringing that into Africa. It's an improved use of water in the corn. There's the soil management, the crop rotations. All of these things that are listed here are parts of the puzzle of how do we do it. And we use all of our technology and understanding to bring those things and affect those so that farmers can use those things more efficiently. And we're going to end up with, you know, better life on the land and hit those sustainable development goals. Reasons this matters is this approximately 1/4 of the global gas emissions are coming from agriculture. And one thing on this that I should share with you is we just recently announced that we are actually paying farmers now to sequester carbon. So we have done the research and the science behind it to be able to tell that when a farmer does certain practices of planting, you know, certain kinds of tillage, reduced tillage and planting cover crops, that they can, how much carbon they can actually take out of the land and sequester into, out of the air and sequester into the land. And this has all been verified with the external stakeholders verification processes. And so what we're trying to develop is that carbon markets are actually a source of revenue, a new source of revenue for farmers. And when I get excited about this is like, we should be able to do this for smallholder farmers. A hectare of land is just as easy to measure as, you know, 1,000 hectares of land. And so if we look at this and then we bring in the technology and know-how to help smallholder farmers to capture carbon and get paid for it, that's a real incentive to change agricultural practices. This is one of the fundamental things to understand about trying to hit these sustainable development goals is you have to find the incentives that are there going to get people to do the practices that you want to have. And we have to uncover what those incentives are. And if we can get that farmers get paid for sequestering carbon and we can prove how much they are actually reducing the, you know, the amount of carbon in the air by these, you know, growing crops and keeping it in the soil, that's a real step change, a way of thinking about what farming is. Let's see, moving on to the next one. As we talk about reducing our environmental impact by 30%, questions there about how can we do that? Again, there's things like the seeds and traits, biologicals. So there's a lot of research going on in our organization to find biological controls rather than, you know, chemical controls. Is there a way that you can use some of the natural microbiome to reduce the disease pressures so that you don't need to spray a fungicide or actually there's a case out there that a lot of people aren't aware of, but BT crops or the GM crops, that's a biological. The BT actually is used by the organic organizations to spray on their crops to kill the insects. And it's been used by the organics organizations for more than 50 years. Basically what we did was we said the delivery of that biological in the plant is what we're going to do, and it works extremely well. So there's an example of, you know, marrying together the technology of a biological with the genetics and putting it together in a crop and actually reducing the amount of pesticides that are used pretty dramatically. Precision farming is another really interesting one. We're doing a lot of study with drones where they can go in and they can use, you know, artificial intelligence and they can use visual ways to actually identify where the weeds are and only go spray where the weeds are, and where there aren't any weeds, you don't have to spray. That sort of precision farming and being very technical, you can still use the same products, but you just use them much more wisely. And of course, that's more economical for the farmer too. The farmer doesn't want to put on more products than what they need to. That costs them money. So there's a lot of different things that we can do in this whole area of environmental impact reduction that we already have been doing and will continue to do. And there's a lot of sustainable development goals associated with that as well, as you can see here. Then the last one is really this empowering the 100 million smallholder farmers. And the ways that we can do that, quite honestly, the one that's not listed on here that should be, in my opinion, is partnerships. So partnerships is central to everything that we're doing with smallholder farmers, because these systems, it's not just about the farmer, it's really about the overall society, the cultural values, the different issues that they run into, that they don't have the infrastructure in place, they may not have the financing, they don't have the education. We really need partnerships in this whole area. This is bigger than any one company can do. But there's a lot that we bring to the table, so to speak, at BAYER from a standpoint of innovation, our commercial activities, things that we have available already for smallholder farmers that they simply aren't aware of and aren't using. And then we've got the, the tailored solutions and market access. All of these different things come together to put to how we're going to address smallholder farmers. And so the example I can give you from the project that I work on is developing drought tolerant and insect resistant seed, corn seed for Africa. And the whole idea there is that we develop these improved maize varieties, and then we make them available to all of the seed companies in Africa on a royalty-free basis. That doesn't mean that the seed is free for the farmer. It means that the seed companies are getting much better seed than what they would normally, and they don't have to pay extra for it. So when they go and produce that seed, then they sell it to the farmers. They can sell it to them a better product at a lower price and really make a difference for those smallholder farmers. So that's one of the examples where you can say, just taking technology in seed and getting that to the farmer only needs to know how to plant the seed, and they're going to get the benefits of that technology. So those are some examples of what we're trying to do on the smallholder front. So this one here just brings that all together, sort of a summation on how the Sustainable Development Goals match up with each of these targets. And happy to answer whatever questions you have with regard to how the Sustainable Development Goals connect on this as we get into the discussion. But I wanted you to be aware that this platform of Sustainable Development Goals is very central to what we're doing at BAYER, and we use it a lot, and there's a high awareness within the company. It's not corporate social responsibility only, it's really that embedding sustainability throughout the whole company, and people that are working on their particular goals. For example, I know that my number one sustainability development goals are number 1, 2, and 3. No poverty, zero hunger, and the good earth. So we really have all of these things built into our systems as we go. But that's what brings me around to sort of the last slide on this, and that is around you get what you measure. And so measuring the progress is really important for this. And so we'll be measuring our progress, comparing the future solutions against the current market standards. So we set a baseline of where we're at, and we're going to be measuring our progress versus that baseline. And that to achieve the sustainable goals, we find common ground with those that are food and those who consume it. And we'll be transparent on our progress. So we're going to be giving annual updates on our sustainability progress. And when we fail, we'll be sure to share that we failed, because not everything that you're going to do is going to be a success. Sometimes you learn the most by your failures, and where things went wrong and what you can do differently. So with that, that's sort of the summation of the story that I have about BAYER and our sustainability goals. And I thank you for the opportunity to share that story. And so now I can stop. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful, and it just seems so incredible to me how well, it should be incredible. It should be self-evident that in communication and international communication, we're facing exactly the same challenges: economic and political shifts, the age of the Anthropocene, and of course, technology and digital technology, and the ethical issues that come with it. We have several questions actually about that, but I would like to invite Dr. Monteiro to ask the first question. I saw you made a note about the sort of regional approach versus global approach. Do you want to ask yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. H, for a wonderful presentation, very comprehensive, and at the same time kind of highlighting how the corporations can de facto make a tangible change, measurable change. And this is a good paradigm for us. My question is, the globalization, we have been touting globalization for many years now. And now this pandemic has kind of made us realize that globalization is really, particularly industrial globalization, is really not the way to go, but it is a regional supply chain. The smaller markets are the ones that, how do you see that? Particularly when you see corporations like BAYER, which is a multinational corporation, kind of trying to fitting into that regional, local markets, and kind of giving also the cultural context, the topographical context, the geographical context to agriculture, to all the in the region. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I'm a big believer in that we're shifting as a society from like an either or approach to a both and. So I believe that global perspective is really important and valuable because it shows the commonality, like I mentioned, like those 40 decisions that farmers make. It's almost the same 40 that you have in Kenya as it is in Iowa. It's just that the circumstances of what they're doing. But as far as growing the crop, trying to get the most out of your land, this is a biological question. And then there's a number of factors that come into like how you make those decisions. So that global perspective is really important. So it's a cliche, to think global and act local. But I think that there's some real value in that cliche, and that if we don't tailor our approach to the local situation and be relevant for that farmer, we won't be successful. So, our success, and this is the thing about, business, is that our success depends upon our customers' success. And so we have to figure out what it is going to be actually unlock the potential at that local level. And it gets down to not even like the community, it gets down to the individual farm. So I see these things at these different levels, that you have global, you have regional, you have country, then you have county, then you have community, then you have your individual farm. And you have to actually be able to think on all of those levels when you're working through these issues, because they're interrelated. And you can't make a decision, for example, a farmer in Iowa deciding whether to plant, what to plant next year needs to know like what's going on with the trade wars with China and whether they're going to buy soybeans or not. Okay, so it's a global issue that you need to be aware of, but it's a local impact that you have to make a decision at the local level. And there's all sorts of those sorts of examples that you come up, particularly in agriculture and farming, where the complexity of it comes together and it actually becomes almost, your eyes start to glaze over when you start to go, because it's too much. It's like you can't possibly know all of those things. You just kind of have to decide and go. But there's this balance of it, and I think that it's not an either or, but a both and.
Thank you very much. And the second question that comes from Ernst McCut here, actually it was in several parts. But of course the issue, as you already mentioned, is sort of what are the takeaway, what are the decisions you need to make when you make decisions around sustainability. So do you focus on GMOs or organic food production? What are the takeaways? And if I heard you right, you are saying it's yes and, or some sort of a middle way instead of either or.
Yeah, well, so this is the thing. There isn't like one right way to do things in farming. What we need to recognize is that it also depends upon your market. If there's somebody that's going to pay you a lot of extra money to grow things organically, and they all feel good about it, and you feel good about it, then you should do that. So there shouldn't be this polemic of either that it's only organic or it's only GMOs. They can coexist together. It's a question about efficiency and willing to pay and what the market is going to reward you. And so farmers are basically in the business of satisfying their customer and making sure that they keep their head above water, so to speak, to pay their bills. So if there's a good market there that will pay for the extra costs, and maybe there aren't extra costs for doing it organic, so then you don't have that. But generally speaking, when you're going to do something different out of the ordinary, there's going to be some extra costs associated with it. So that's where you have to figure out the sustainability part of that is the economic piece of the sustainability that you need to work through. So rather than get prescriptive that there needs to be one way or the other, I look at it and say, what's your particular situation and what's your market, and will you be able to make it work for you? Now, there are certain practices that are just good stewardship. So this is where we run into this challenge, is that I don't want you to go away with the thinking that I believe that market forces are the only thing that you need to be able to make sure that we have a sustainable environment, because the market doesn't always build in all the costs of the different things that you're doing, for example. So if we could get a carbon market established, because there is a cost to society for carbon, and then you could actually pay a farmer for actually sequestering carbon, we would have a lot more things done at the farm level that would be better for the soil, for soil health in the long term, because then there's a reward for it. So we need these ways that are rewarding that good behavior, and don't believe that only the market will reward the good behavior, because there's things beyond what the market does that doesn't just deliver the good behavior. So this is the tricky part of that, is what I find frustrating on this whole thing is, having grown up on the farm, it was always part of what we always thought about, is that the farm needs to be passed on to your family, and so you want to take good care of it. Stewardship of your land, if you own it, is very important, because it's your main asset. And so you need to learn about stewardship, because it's your main asset that you want to protect. Just like if your main asset is your house, you take good care of your house, right? So it's that same sort of mentality that is there about maintaining the asset. One of the things that I see as a challenge many places globally is that the people that are on the land don't actually have a vested interest in maintaining the land. Sometimes the government owns it, somebody else owns it. There's lots of issues involved in this. So you can go down any sorts of paths on this, that land ownership and land tenure is an essential issue in all of this. And there's a big social piece of that. And so that's why it's like, well, what we're doing in the US is not necessarily what's right for Tanzania or for Nigeria or for India, for example. Each place has its own cultural values of what it needs to do and what works. But that's where I think the pragmatic of like what works, and is it really improving sustainability of the land? And I think that's the question that isn't always asked. The piece that isn't rewarded, because society isn't really rewarding stewardship of the land. The farmers generally have an interest to steward the land, but they're not always rewarded for that, and that's a challenge. And I don't have an answer. I don't have an easy answer for that one, unfortunately. I hope all of you can help create. I think awareness of it is probably the biggest thing, that society has a role to play, and being informed about this is one of the best ways that society can impact those sorts of positive behaviors. So.
It's interesting you mentioned that. Actually, that was one of the first questions Dr. Monteiro posed on the chat. What kind of role could we play from your perspective and actually that was a couple of students actually in my course also asked the same. What can we do? It seems that well, BAYER is doing great work, but so many companies are not.
Yeah, if I could answer that, I think first of all, you're already doing it. You're listening, you're learning, you're trying to understand better, just being engaged in the conversation. And then I think one of the challenges that I see is in this whole area of sustainability, we have to come to grips that there's trade-offs. And so managing these trade-offs is where the rubber hits the road and the conflict comes up. Because one set of group has their idea of the way to manage it, and another group has their ideas, and they feel like they're diametrically opposed, and they both want the same good outcome, but they believe, vehemently that their way is the right way. And this is where, as communicators, I think you have a real role to dig in and say, well, okay, I understand what the objective is, and I think that the goal is really good here, what you're trying to do, but where's the evidence that what you're saying is actually working in that particular situation, and what's the science behind it? And people don't like to be challenged with those sorts of questions, quite honestly, because then it leads into this, well, you know, it leads into endless discussions, quite honestly, that, and of course, scientists can and should disagree. So there isn't always a scientific consensus around things. So the challenge of communicating science is central to a lot of these things that I see around the Sustainable Development Goals, because you're managing trade-offs and you have to do your decisions based on evidence. And the evidence isn't like you can come up, for example, it's actually quite different than the carbon situation of the global greenhouses, because, you know, the air, I mean, whether you've got high carbon in China or high carbon in your air in the United States, you're still going to have similar sort of the problems. But if you're in agriculture, you know, your soils are very different in Africa than they are in India, than they are in China, than, you know, so your local environment is so different that you can't come up with one solution fits all in agriculture. So it can get really frustrating to have that conversation, because you end up, well, yes, you could do this, or yes, you could do that, and you sound like you don't know anything because everything works. And I find it really a challenge to figure out how to communicate in that and say, let's find a way to use real science. And this is where I get excited about the digital piece of this, that we can actually start to measure the environment so much more accurately and really make decisions based on real data at that local level that is not, projecting an idea on something, but it's actually measuring a real reality there. So the ability to measure, to know what's actually going on in a local environment because of digital technology is going to change agriculture in ways that I can't even imagine yet, but it is very substantial. And so this is where the digital transformation is not about, you know, your social media that you can able to communicate around the world like we are right now. It's about pulling in information on that 1 hectare of land that you're planting and saying, there are millions of data points about that 1 hectare, and I'm going to use all of this information to be able to make a decision about what to do on that 1 hectare, which is very different than what I would do, you know, just 2 counties over on another hectare. Data can, you know, environmental data can empower that sort of decision making. And so that's why I would encourage that you learn more about how decisions, you know, the overall process of communication requires evidence, and that the evidence is actually coming through these digital tools, and we can actually be asking those really hard questions as we go forward.
Thank you. Fascinating and demanding from all of us, isn't it? I have a lot going on in the chat. Ernest, since we already addressed one of your questions, we'll get back to you. I'll take a couple of others, and don't mind me, then we get back to you. There's a very specific question about South Asia and the specifically demanding context in terms of climate change. How are you thinking through it? Because obviously climate change is such an issue for your sector.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things when it comes to climate change. There's mitigation and there's adaptation. In agriculture, we can maybe do a little bit of both, but more we focus generally on the adaptation, because we don't always feel like we can do so much to mitigate it. However, I would say that we're turning the corner around this and saying, you know, actually, if the only thing that takes out carbon out of the air is green plants, we grow green plants, so there's a way to capture that. So we can get into the mitigation by the practices that we do and the systems that we put in place. So that's, you know, precision agriculture and all of this, you can focus on mitigation. But then the other part is the adaptation. If the climate is going to change, then you're going to have to figure out how to adapt. And that means that the crops move. So you, just as a case in point, 40 years ago, there was hardly any corn that was grown in North Dakota. or soy. I mean, it's a wheat, it used to be wheat country only. Now in North Dakota, there's actually a lot of corn and soybeans that is grown there, and quite successfully. It's not hurting the environment. They used to be growing something else, growing wheat, but they're actually being more productive with their corn and their soybeans. But it's partly because the environment has changed, that the days are a little bit warmer and you get a longer growing season. But it's also because the genetics have changed, that we've been able to breed crops that'll go further north and be able to be adapted to that environment. So it's this combination of using the tools that we have to adapt the crops to the new environments that we're going, and say you can move into new areas or do things differently. We need a whole bunch of creative thinking around cropping systems, and as the climate changes, what do you do differently? What do you grow differently? And how do you do that? And this is where I get excited about some of the biological technology that's coming along. So this new CRISPR-Cas9 stuff for doing gene editing, that allows you to actually go in and specifically change something in the plant's DNA that is going to make an adaptant. So they've already done this in wheat, for example, in Argentina, that there's drought-tolerant wheat. I was just talking with a colleague of mine here in St. Louis that's working at a development center called the Danforth Center, and they are using gene editing for a crop in Africa called teff in Ethiopia. And one of the problems with teff is that it's a grass and it grows tall and then it falls over, and so you lose a lot of your at harvest, pre-harvest loss. And if you can go in and you can edit the plant so that it grows a shorter stem, they call it a semi-dwarf or short-statured teff, suddenly you don't have the crop falling over, and you have a much better harvest index because you get better yield. Those sorts of adaptations are what we've seen. And you know, 50 years ago, Norman Borlaug won the World Food Prize, the World Nobel Peace Prize, because of that, doing that same thing through traditional breeding. We're doing the same thing in breeding now. We're just being much more precise, much more fast about it. And so that connection with food security and how genetics and crop improvement have been around for a long time. You know, there's been a Nobel Peace Prize because of it in the Green Revolution. But now we're really into a green revolution, and actually many people call it the gene revolution, and the ability to use biology to change these things so precisely and do that adaptation. So climate change is both a threat and then it's an opportunity, and it's a challenge for us to understand what technologies we can use to adapt faster, but we also need to do what we can to mitigate. So that was a long answer to your simple question. I'm sorry if I'm running on too long.
No, but thank you for also broadening it up. Not only talking about the specific region, but you broadened the issue up. There's a question which is pretty specific, but I think it has to do with broader issues as well. The question goes like this: you mentioned land tenure. Understanding that you work mostly in innovating around the technological issues of farming and technical issues to benefit the farmer, what role, if any, are you playing in issues such as land tenure reform? And I think that relates to more broadly, how do you deal with sort of local and national political and economic issues and even human rights?
Yeah, those are all important things, and I think it is important to recognize is that there is an element, a big element of all of this that is around policy, and we do focus on, you know, trying to make sure that there's an enabling environment for people to thrive, and when there is not a good policy environment there, or there's things there, then we have an obligation, along with many other stakeholders and people in this space, to do what we can to try to influence the policy to make it that we can see where are the main constraints and how do we remove those constraints. When it comes to an issue specifically like land tenure, there isn't a genetic or a product, so to speak, that we're going to create that's going to address that issue. That's a social and a cultural issue around that. But there are oftentimes technical issues that are associated with that there might be a technical solution that you could share with people to say you could solve these problems and then you could do it. So, you know, digital tools, if you can get a drone to go up and fly and do this aerial surveying, and you can actually mark things out, and then you can capture it digitally and do all of this, you can leapfrog all of these challenges that they have and actually map things out, be extremely accurate, and create a record that can be verified. And then particularly if you think about maybe blockchain technology of this, where it can't be corrupted in some way, you know, those technologies can unlock some of the main problems that there are, because there's usually huge bureaucratic problems and huge administrative problems of trying to figure out how you're going to get all those records and how you're going to keep them secure, and that somebody isn't going to use them to, you know, corrupt the system so that they can, you know, put all the money in their own pocket. So I think that there's lots of creative ways that the younger generation is going to be creating, and these are business opportunities for people to say, this is an issue out there. Now there's a new way to address it. We don't have to like lay the landlines anymore. We can just go directly to the cell phone. One of my favorite stories is how when I was younger and I traveled around Latin America, to make a phone call was just extremely difficult. And you would go down like Buenos Aires and you'd go up above, there was all these lines up above and everything. Now, you know, I go to a developing country and everybody has their cell phone and there are no landlines because they just didn't need it. And suddenly this big problem that they had that they couldn't resolve because they couldn't get together as a society to put that infrastructure in place, it suddenly became actually very feasible to do it with the mobile phones. And suddenly you have a much better system. You know, in Kenya, they actually have a better mobile money system than we have here in the United States. They moved to mobile money with this M-Pesa fast. You know, we don't do that here in the US. So I see all sorts of reasons to be very hopeful for these sorts of changes. I wouldn't say it's necessarily going to come from BAYER. We're part of that ecosystem and we help maybe enable it. And this is where I think the partnership part of what we're doing and being very transparent and saying, we can't solve everything. We're just one small player in this big ocean of challenges that we have. How are we going to work together, and how do we find ways where there's synergies across those things? So land tenure, I don't think that BAYER is going to jump in and start to do anything specifically on that, but I see opportunities to be, you know, at the table and talking about ways that you could address it and the impacts that it could have, and you could foster an environment to help make those things happen.
Thank you very much. I just noticed that a related question had come, which I hadn't seen, from Hallelujah Lives Flannery. And Hallelujah, I know you're working on blockchain, and actually we work together on blockchain issues and using it, for instance, creating land titles and identities and identity detection and so on and so forth. Hallelujah, do you want to comment on this or continue with this question? You're happy with the answer?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. If I do want to continue on with a little bit, just more specifically, because just a little background. So the work I did in law school had to do with corporate accountability and land rights in Brazil, land rights regarding for indigenous people in Brazil. And so I had to communicate with multinational corporations like BAYER, for example, not BAYER, but specifically, but corporations like yourself, and ensuring that these companies are not involved with atrocity crimes on the ground through their subsidiaries or others on their supply chain. So just wondering like what BAYER was doing specifically to ensure that there were no atrocities happening on the ground where they are located.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it's very important that we do address that. You know, human rights and workers' rights and treating people as they deserve to be treated is central to what we do. So our supply chains, we make sure that they're integrated in this whole process and get the human rights training. You know, we have, for example, there's a lot of seed production that is done that requires hand labor and farm labor, particularly thinking about India. And I know that we go there and we contract with our providers to do that. But what we do is we go and inspect those providers and make sure that they're living up to our standards. And of course, then we have to pay them fair wages and make sure that it's getting to the end users. And so, you know, this is not a new issue at all for agriculture. In many ways, here in the U.S., for our, you know, corn production, our hybrid seed corn production, you know, there's always a lot of migrants that are coming through and doing the detasseling. That's been around for a long time. We, you know, have to provide housing for them, and you have to provide, you know, health services for them, and you know, toilets and all of those sorts of things. So we do take those things very seriously, and we make sure that our contractors realize it too. And if they fail to, we cancel the, you know, we terminate the contracts. I mean, you have to follow through on it as well, and make sure that you're not just, you know, greenwashing it or whitewashing it, and making sure that those things are actually happening. And we've always found that, you know, being very strong on those issues, particularly in developing countries, is actually builds tremendous loyalty in those countries towards our brand. So when you start to see it not as a cost, but as an investment of building trust and loyalty, it turns things around a little bit. And I think that's, as much as anything within corporations, is this psychology about that things are a cost. Well, you know, there's a cost for not doing things as well. And so if you put it in the terms of this opportunity cost, and it's like, yes, it may cost a little bit on the short run, it costs a little bit more, but we have a better product, and we have a better reputation, and a more robust license to operate. That in the long term is a really good investment. And so when you start to look at these things as actually an investment and a good return on investment, and that's how we've actually built sustainability into what we do as well. We're not doing this just because it's going to sound good when we go and talk at the UN Food Summit or something. We're actually doing it because it saves us money also. And the hard part is always getting to measuring how it actually saves you money, because sometimes things are not as obvious as they look. You may think that you're saving yourself money, but you're actually costing yourself money because your yield is lower because of something, So it's very important to build in the incentives for doing the right thing. And I think that comes from an attitude as much as anything, and making sure that you have that attitude ingrained in your culture of your company. And so we spend a lot of time on that, and the values of ourselves. So as an employee of BAYER, there's a strong sense of building a culture within the company that is around these values, and so that it's really easy to make the decision to do the right thing, rather than just focus on it's the quick way to make more money, and I'll get rewarded because I helped the company make a few more bucks. That is not what gets rewarded. So you kind of get the behaviors that you reward, what you measure and what you reward, and we need to make sure that we build in those rewards for doing the right thing.
Thank you. Really important part of this conversation, of course, and you already touched upon this, but I see this kind of connects Ernest McCarthy's question and Dr. Montero's question. If we think about sustainability, and just as from a layperson's perspective, it is about modesty and sort of modest consumption, and Ernest made a point of all the excess in the US versus how can we really feed the world, if that's your vision and mission, when we have these disparities, and very disparities, as you so well also highlighted in your presentation, in levels of consumption and levels of lifestyle. How can we really feed the world, and how can we perhaps make those with excess, or can we, in this sort of from economic perspective, really advocate moderation?
Yeah, there we're talking about individual choices of what they want to do, and it's very hard. We can't seem to get everybody to wear a mask, so getting everybody to eat the right amount or not waste is a real challenge. I think one of the things I see is that rather than see these things as trying to force people to do the right thing, try to build in incentives that are going to recognizes that when they do the wrong thing, turn it into that there's something that beneficial comes out of it. So I would really think that there's a lot that could be done on addressing waste in the system, and how do you turn that into a benefit or a product that is actually beneficial for society. So energy, food is basically energy, and yet when it goes to waste, we don't capture any of that energy. We just let it sort of dissipate. We're not very creative all the time, and one of the challenges is that it's generally not economically viable. We're having a lot of trouble with just like recycling plastic right now. That there's, here in St. Louis, it's been recently, it's like, well, you have your recycling bin, but how much of that in your recycling bin is actually just going to the dump anyway, because they're not making any money on the recycling. So these are really challenging problems in society that I just think one of it is creating sort of a culture of, we don't have to do without, but we don't need to overindulge either. And that you feel better actually when you are actually living within certain boundaries and not wasting. But all I can say is try to model good behavior, try to encourage that good behavior, and don't try to force people to do it, but try to find ways that it's like that you're going to see the benefits of doing that. And it's kind of like raising toddlers. You can't force them to do what you want them to do. You have to actually figure out how to encourage them to do those things. And there's a lot about human psychology there, and I'm not a psychologist by any stretch of the imagination. So you're asking me questions that are kind of outside of my bounds as far as how to answer that. But everybody has a right to an opinion on it, and I'm sure many people have much better ideas about it than I do. We're all in this together, though, and that's where I welcome ideas that folks have about how could we at BAYER as a company, what could we do, where is it that we're missing, and how, let's be open to those suggestions and things to try things differently.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of food for thought. I would like to selfishly take the opportunity to ask something that I've been wondering, and now I'm moving to a very sort of perhaps practical and how would I put it? Yeah, not such a big question, but I've been wondering, and I'm sure Dr. Montero as well, we remember the Millennium Development Goals that the UN had and nobody knew about. It was a communication disaster, if you would say. And what I've seen now is venture capitalists, and as I said to my students, the city of Helsinki has adopted the Sustainable Development Goals from their own perspectives, as is your company. What made you and what made so many companies to actually take on SDGs and use them as benchmarks and internally and externally?
No, that's a really good question. There's sometimes things are about timing. The society is more interconnected now and having more of a global dialogue and seeing these issues. So, this whole thing about global warming, and that has been building momentum for the last 40 years. I remember as a kid on the farm, it's like, oh, they would always say, oh, it's global warming, now it's changed to climate change, which is more accurate discussion. So these things don't happen overnight. I think that there's an evolution on it, but I think there's also a strategic piece on this about communications that's very informative around this. And that is that they learned, I think, from the Millennial Challenge goals that they needed a different approach from a communication standpoint. And I think that there's a lot to learn in that. And I'm certainly not a communications expert, so you guys can probably all tell me way better than myself. But from my perception of it, the Millennial Challenge goals were sort of this big picture, we're gonna do this, but it didn't have it broken down into parts that you could, grab onto your part, so to speak. It was like everything was holistic, and you just had to, it was just go in there and make all of these things happen. But if you weren't part of that, then you could just, I don't know where to fit in, right? So what I see with this Sustainable Development Goals approach is that it's a very sort of open architecture, but it's got a set of really important global goals that we're all can kind of agree on is as like, this is a direction that we would like to be. I mean, it's hard to say no to the Sustainable Development Goals, because how can you be against those things? You know, it's just, now it's about the nuances of whether this is the right thing or that's the right thing, but you can't be against them. And so then it creates this common dialogue, but it also creates this, like, you don't have to do all of it. You can take one piece of it and you can be part of this one and just do something, and that'll, you know, that will make a difference. And I think that there's a communications piece about that, that you personalize it for people in a way that stories, I mean, this is what I always appreciate about communications people, that good communications people turn things into a story that people relate to. And they relate to it because it's personal to them. And so these Sustainable Development Goals needed to be in a way that you can say, I can relate to doing something of those. So, you know, quite honestly, within BAYER, I can connect something in BAYER to all 17 development goals. But me personally, I'm not connected to all 17 of them. There's a bunch of people over there that are doing their thing, and I'm over here doing mine. I'm proud to be in a company that has this breadth of interactions and this opportunity for me to engage with so many other things and learn so much. But when it comes down to my daily and what I want to tell somebody about what I'm doing, you know, I get excited about telling them I'm helping to make drought tolerant and insect corn available to smallholder farmers so that they can get a better crop. You know, that's personal and it's tangible. And I think that's what the Sustainable Development Goals do, and how it's different from how the Millennial Challenge was established. And I think that's the secret to it as well, is that it allows for this variation, and it's like, you're all part of it, but you can do your own piece, and it doesn't have to be all of it. It needs to be all of us doing our bit. And that's where, as a big company, we have to have the humility to say, we may be touching all of them, but I can tell you, we're not going to fix all of those alone. The only way we do this is through partnerships, and we learn from all of you, and this is the open architecture of transparency as well. And this is one of the things that's probably the hardest thing for the private sector to come around to, I would say, is that generally speaking, you know, you're in competition, and that if you have some advantage or knowledge of something that somebody else doesn't have, that's your differentiator, that's how you get paid. So there's a natural tension there in the private sector, that some of these things we may not really want to share with everybody. And I think that's a limitation about what the private sector can do, that we have to get more comfortable with sharing, being more open, but we also have to be protective of, like, we still have to make, you know, the payments at the end of the day. We have to be able to be sustainable from an economic standpoint. And that's where I like being a part of public-private partnerships. So this project that I work on in Africa, you know, it's one private company, us, but there's 7 governments involved, and there's, you know, a nonprofit that's at the center of this management. And I've learned so much by dealing with these folks in the public sector and the approach that they take and the things that they're able to do it now. And so I think there's just a lot of synergy that comes out of that. So that's what I see, the beauty, a lot of beauty in the Sustainable Development Goals of the way that they've been structured. And I think that you know, I was a little bit hesitant when they first came out because it's so overwhelming and so daunting. But I think people, it was very smart putting them in those little boxes, those little things, and can be separated out, because then you can take that one and you can own it, rather than have to do all 17 at once. And I just think that that's really important from a communication standpoint of being able to do it. So, you know, kudos to whoever had the brains to put all that together, in my opinion.
I believe it was a Swedish advertising company. I think, yeah. We went to the launch of one of the launches of some of my students years back, quite a few years back. My goodness, time flies. You mentioned partnerships, and it's very interesting what you've already told us. When one thinks about corporate social responsibility, it is a company has a foundation, and and donates money. So what you're explaining to us is something quite different, and you talk about partnerships. Is this the corporate social responsibility model that is now more common, or do you see this that more companies are embracing sort of more participatory and partnership type of
I think it depends. I think that I think the trend is definitely going this way. I think BAYER is ahead of the, further along that than many others, depending upon the sector. Agriculture by its nature has so many complexities and so many to be holistic about it, that it actually creates this really natural opportunity in agriculture to do that. Other industries, it may not be quite as obvious or so easy to do that. But we have a foundation as well. We have the BAYER Foundation, and they do give money, and they, because there's things that are, you want to contribute to the society. And a lot of times those are things that are focused on where we actually are in the community. For example, here in St. Louis, we would give to the United Way, or we give to, because there's things that are not part of our business, but it's part of the society and where we live. And so we're a corporate citizen here, and we need to give back to the communities. So there's lots of different levels on this whole corporate social responsibility. And I think it's really important to maintain corporate social responsibility and grow that, and say we have a lot to do in that area as well. I think that the sustainability piece of this, though, allows us to change our mindsets around and say it's not a cost, it's an investment in an increased efficiency. So for me at least, growing up on a farm, I was like, sustainability, this is just efficiency in a new word, because as I grew up on the farm, it was always about how do you grow more with less. I mean, there's nothing new to me on that. We always were trying to get more crop using less product. So from a farmer's perspective, and this whole thing with sustainability, there's nothing new, but there's a way of talking about it that society is doing that, and so it folds into a business piece of this. It's like, yes, you do need to get more using less. And all of you, if you've ever spent any time in corporate, they're always going to go, you're being asked to do more with less budget. So it's kind of the same thing. You're always being asked to do more with less resources. And it's just what we need to do in the society standard, is keep pushing the boundaries of that, of figuring out, because that is, necessity is the mother of all invention. Well, those sorts of challenges, those tensions, creates those sorts of opportunities for us to innovate and do new ways and find ways to be more sustainable. So, yeah.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to Dr. Monteiro for his last remarks, many of my students wanted to know, how has the COVID crisis changed what you do and how you work? Especially for you, I mean, you mentioned it since you travel constantly and live multinational.
Yeah. Well, my personal carbon footprint is much lower now than it was, because I haven't traveled since March. But on the downside of that, interpersonal relationships, and particularly when I go to Africa, it's a high context society. You really need to meet people. You need to see them eye to eye and really talk with them and really get to know their reality. So on the one hand, it's created new opportunities where you see there's a way to do this with less travel. And so we won't go back, I'm sure, to doing as much travel as we used to do. But on the other hand, it also shows up there's limitations for the existing way. And there's less, I'm a people person, so it's really frustrating that I'm not out there actually speaking to all of you face to face today. And the challenge of communicating what your passion and what you feel and get the interaction that's nice. But on COVID, on another level, there's a personal level, but I think that there's another one from a business level, is that it has really sent shockwaves through the food systems. And it's exposed vulnerabilities around the world on the food systems. They haven't fallen apart. The food systems are actually quite resilient, but there are many people that are have been living on the edge, that have been thrown over into a very much more serious situation. And that's one of the reasons the World Food Program won the Nobel Peace Prize this year is because of the response to COVID. So food is at the center of all that we do and what we're trying to do in crop science, you know, health for all and hunger for none. And COVID has, I think, created this urgency that we have to rethink what we do, and we have to find ways to get more resilience built in and more efficiencies, less steps in the value chain. Everybody talks about the value chain, but the reality is you need to look at how do you take out all of those middle steps that aren't efficient, and make them more dynamic and resilient. And you know, there's a whole bunch of things that are based on information sharing there that the digital tools really could unlock a lot of things in that at local markets sort of thing about supply and demand. Matching supply and demand is always the challenge in agriculture. We need to rethink how that is all done. And I think that there's huge opportunities on that, but it's also heightened the importance of what we do and our role in it. So, you know, one of the responses that we've done as a company is in low and middle income countries in India, in Southeast Asia, and also in Africa, we've made seed kits available where we make seed, you know, get the local NGOs to distribute seed to farmers who wouldn't normally purchase from us, okay? Because they're usually doing their own saved seed sort of thing, which yields much less. So if you can get them better seed, they'll get, you know, a better crop and improve their livelihood. So we haven't given so much as cash to try and address this, but we've given technology in a form of seed as something that's going to help them see a different way to do something, and try to work through that. So I've been in conversations with the World Food Program about that in Africa, where we're doing this so that as they think about putting their you know, responses back together, particularly like in East Africa with the locust infestations, you know, we're distributing seed in some of those areas so that hopefully we'll get better crops and there won't be as much of a threat on the food security of those people. So, you know, we're doing our own things, what we can in our small way, but it's clearly highlighted many of the vulnerabilities of the system.
Thank you, Mark, if I may. You said urgency for more resilience, efficiency, and dealing with vulnerabilities. I think the field of communication has gone through exactly the same. Thank you from my part, from deep from my heart. And I'm sure I speak for my student as well. This has been wonderful. Now I give the last word to Dr. Monteiro.
For a wonderful presentation, very rich presentation, so much to think, so much food for thought for our students. And thank you very much, Meena, for moderating and getting us conversation. In our Master's in International Communication program that we have, and most of the students are coming out from the program, we've embraced for some time now, for the last at least 6-7 years now, Sustainable Development Goals as a pedagogical tool for us, as a way to introduce them and kind of demythologize, because the word sustainable in itself kind of is not very sexy, it's not very exciting. It's kind of, you know, it calls for, oh, sustainable, that means I'm at the margins of the life, you know, I have to be very modest. So it kind of goes against our cultural way of thinking, because in our culture, we promote extravagance, we promote high consumption and everything else. But modesty and sustainability, so it's kind of a new cultural adaptation that we have to go through. And we address these issues in our master's program in international communication, you know, which focuses on public diplomacy, focuses on international relations, focuses on political economy of media, and through all that kind of, you know, pointing that centrality of communication, as you so many times you try to highlight the key, the importance of communication in this. And so I'm very grateful to you for taking the time and kind of giving this very, very erudite presentation and very comprehensive presentation. I hope you can come back to us again and talk more about it and kind of, you know, see how even we could have a little pilot project going in our program, in what way we could, you know, promote this in reality, not just academically, not in the classroom, some kind of through some assignments. Interestingly, one of my class that is meeting here today, we are working this semester in partnership on the related development goal with the University of Zimbabwe, with the University of Rotterdam, University of Valencia, and University of São Paulo in Brazil. So they are meeting together and focused on the honey from Zimbabwe, how the honey from Zimbabwe can be cultivated and made available at the local market and also at the global market. And so there is a growing thinking that is taking place. And I hope that this master's program, International Communication, helps them to think through and see that sustainable development goal not only is something that they want to accomplish or we need to accomplish, but as a way of learning. And that is what we're trying to do. And so I'm very grateful to you for being with us, and to all my colleagues and to all our students who have been with us. And we will have more of these conversations. So be prepared. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Edmund. My goodness, Edmund is another sustainable development guy as an architect. He's an architect and he's always thinking sustainable architecture. He has some terrific ideas. Maybe we should have him one day to do a presentation for us. Yeah. So
it's been my absolute pleasure. I hope that you were able to get something valuable out of it. I always enjoy the opportunity to share, and I will tell you that as a scientist, I always am looking for my colleagues in communications who can help us get the science communicated out effectively. And I've learned the hard way over many years about the failures of science are oftentimes that we fail to communicate effectively about what we're doing. So we really need folks like all of you to be engaged, and I appreciate your interest in this. I encourage you to, in your careers, reach out and ask the hard questions, find the right answers, and really go after that. And don't be afraid of those scientists. Go in and ask them the hard questions and say, I really need to understand this, turn this into a story that actually people will listen to. And because as scientists generally, we're not so good at telling stories that people will listen to.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a big role to play. And I always welcome the opportunity to share my perspective with you, and want to say thank you for all that you're doing, and wish you all the best of luck. And again, if I can contribute in any way going forward, please don't hesitate to let me know. And Natalia, thank you for helping to make the connection. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you. All right.
If I may talk just one little point about science and communication. 2 years ago, one of our students did a master's thesis in our program, International Communication, on communicating climate change. And the whole scientific, and it was very well done, in fact. And so we have kind of tried to break down that kind of thing. So I also want to say a special thanks to Natalia Gundel for being the force behind this and bring us together and connecting us with Mark Edge, and also connecting us with BAYER Company. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we will meet and we will see again each other.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.